This is afternoon somewhere in England, but our audience throughout the world will be on a different time scale, a different time of day. I'm Mike Byram, formerly of the University of Durham, and this afternoon with Alan Dobson, who is also on screen, we'll be talking to Do Coyle. And maybe, Do, you can just briefly introduce yourself before we go to asking you a bit more.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Yes, hello everyone. So currently, I'm working at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm professor in language education and classroom pedagogies. And actually, I suppose those two phrases really sum up my entire work in terms of language education and the focus that I have on classroom pedagogy, since that's where all of my research lies. So looking forward to talking to you all.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we always begin by asking people how they became what we call language people, people who are, in some sense, invested in language and how they're living through language and language teaching or whatever it is. And so our first question is always, how did you become what you now are? How did you become a language person at school, university, and so on?
Okay, well, I think when we look back, I think it's really important to situate it in the period in history, dare I say, when I was born and growing up. And that was in the post-war period. And quite frankly, for anybody growing up in the 60s and 70s, I have to say I feel really privileged and lucky. I didn't realize how lucky I was at the time. But nonetheless, born into a large working class family in Lancashire, I was fortunate to have lovely parents who always wanted their girls to have all the opportunities that they never had. And of course, at that period in time, education was completely free. So that was the atmosphere in which we grew up. And it wasn't about self-promotion. It was always about, situated in a really kind of Methodist moral code, was always about doing your best and putting other people before you, and that kind of sentiment. But at the same time, it was also an era where women were experiencing more autonomy than ever before. So with those strong moral principles and so on, I attended the local primary school, and I remember in our top class at primary school, there were 45 of us. And at that stage, we took the 11 plus, and I went to the local grammar school. The grammar school was very, very small, and it was mixed, which was very unusual for the time, which also gave the advantage of having genuine friends, and that confidence to have friends, either male or female. It was very special. But anyway, the whole thing about being able to make most of opportunities came about because I just knew there was a big world out there, and my Auntie Gladys got a television quite early on, and therefore being able to go to Auntie Gladys's and watch TV was very special. And I was allowed to put the only thing I could have on my bedroom wall was it wasn't a poster as such, it was the world map. And I used to look at Vladivostok, which is at the end of the Trans-Siberian Railway. And I used to promise myself that one day I would go right to the other side of the world, and that was where I would go. But what I really was excited about when I went to secondary school, when I went to grammar school, was to learn languages, because I was thinking too far ahead too quickly, basically, and I wanted to be able to talk. I wanted to be able to speak and communicate with people. So I got the shock of my life when we started learning French to begin with, because I found it the most tedious, boring thing in the curriculum. And I couldn't believe that something as exciting as languages was being taught in that way. I have to say here that I'm not denigrating the teachers there. They were following the traditional pedagogy of the era. But I did have an aha moment when we used Whitmarsh, and the normal chapter layout for Whitmarsh was a text followed by some comprehension questions and then grammar exercises. And on one occasion, the text was serialized, and it was about the Maquis, and I'd never heard of the Maquis before, and I found myself skipping over pages so I could carry on reading the story. And I began to realize that this was really where I wanted to be, and to wait until I was allowed to use literature and so on was just too long a wait. So I became increasingly frustrated. And things changed radically when in the second year we started learning Russian. And why, I do not know to this day why we all started learning Russian. But of course, it was the height of the Cold War. And so not only did everybody think we were very clever because we could speak Russian, but the approach to Russian was very different to the approach to French. And it excited me beyond all means. And I was determined I wanted to have a job in the Foreign Office. Only to discover, of course, that I did not have the background. I didn't come from the right kind of family to gain such elevated heights. So in kind of frustration and anger as a result, I was determined that I was going to make a difference. I wanted to do something with languages, and I wanted them to be better than they were in school. So I thought, well, I'm going to become a language teacher. And I made a promise to myself, and this is absolutely true. I made a promise to myself that no child in my care would ever experience what I'd experienced. In other words, I wanted to really motivate, but I use that term very, very carefully because now it means so many other things, but I just wanted to inspire all children, not just the brightest or whatever. I wanted to inspire all children to love languages and to really celebrate them for what they were able to do in terms of the world and understanding the world. So very idealistic, of course, but I had a right to be as an adolescent. And I guess that most of us at that period in our lives, regardless of which era you were born in, come with that drive to do something. And for me, it was the drive and the promise to make a difference. So as a result of that, I did French, Russian, English, and general studies at A level, but I decided I wanted to do a BEd. So I went to Nottingham College of Education and the University of Nottingham. And there I did a BEd, but I also did a DEA, Diplôme d'études approfondies, in Tours, the University of Poitiers. And so already I was starting to really understand things, but something wonderful, something magical happened in Tours, which I think is a nice anecdote that I will tell. So at the time when you were an overseas student there was a friendship club that you signed up for. I did that. It wasn't digital at the time. And so I had a little interview and they asked me what I liked. And I thought I'd said in my best French that I liked culture, and I pronounced it as, I thought I'd said culture, but they misheard. They didn't mishear. I mispronounced, and it came out as couture. And consequently, they linked me up to this little lady who was very elderly, who did tapestries. Now, I thought I was going along to this family that would be going to the cinema and da-da-da-da. And I roll up to this widow on her own, and she was doing tapestries. So out of politeness, I carried on going on a Thursday evening. But it was magical in the end because we got to know each other. I learned every single shade and color of every silk you can imagine. But also she started to tell me stories, war stories again, what had happened and so on. And that made me understand the kind of the real sense and purpose of being able to use languages. And I thought, right, okay, so the next stage in my drive is to make sure that not only will all of my learners love languages, they will also have access in some shape or form to talking to real people in real time, and they'll be autonomous learners. So that really is, a kind of history of where I became a language person and started teaching. I also have another anecdote, which again fits in, that my final teaching practice, which was at a very, very difficult school in Nottingham, was using Gilbert's famous book about the monkey and the monkey in the tree. And there was I teaching these adolescents French, and I had to do it. I was on teaching practice. I was told I had to do this chapter. And we were talking about, where is the monkey? The monkey is on the branch. Where is the blah, 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 blah. And that's what Eddie Izzard has really capitalized on in some of his shows, the comedian. And again, it just did not make any sense whatsoever to me why I was spending that time talking about monkeys in trees. It had no meaning. So what with wanting to change resources, but above all wanting to give learners a genuine experience of speaking the language, whether it was with first language speakers of that language, or it didn't matter. If language was the medium for communication and understanding, that's where I wanted to be. So that's how I became a language person.
Thank you. That's lovely. And those anecdotes, yeah, they're great. I think for our international viewers, we'll also have to put a few footnotes to explain a little bit of that. But let's not worry about that now. We can add those things in because, yeah, it's great to have those anecdotes because they're so telling. But one question for me was just to clarify, when you said you were teaching on teaching, that was secondary school?
I did. I managed to do what they called both middle and middle school, really, but also secondary, because we were near to Leicestershire, and at the time Leicestershire had a strange system where, well, not strange, but a different system where we had middle schools and then upper schools. But fortunately, I mean, most of the teaching anyway, because at the time there was very little, if any, language teaching going on in primary schools. The middle schools there were, of course, but so that it was mainly secondary and it was mainly French at the time. Although I did teach Russian as well.
Oh, so you also taught Russian, yeah? So
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, the schools. I mean, I've worked in many schools, but the three main schools I worked in England. The first one was a middle school in Ashby de la Zouch of Ivanhoe fame. In fact, the school was called Ivanhoe. The second one was in an 11 to 18 school in Loughborough. And the third one was probably the most special job I ever had. And that was working in a brand new school. It was a new build school, rehousing a socioeconomically deprived area. But what they did at the time, which they wouldn't do now, was that they built it up year by year. And so we started off with year sevens and then year eights and so on. And again, that was magical because we were all young career-minded heads of faculty. So it was very, very special, and we were able to do amazing things with the learners.
So you're allowed to do allowed is perhaps, I don't know whether allowed is quite the word, but some of our previous interviewees have talked about roughly the same time as you, that they felt a freedom to try things out and do things and experiment, which they feel from observation teachers today don't have.
It was exactly that. I'm not sure whether I'm going on too far now, but it was the era of the graded tests, and Wilkins's notional functional syllabus had come into being, and I've been inspired by that. Plus, there was a lot of emphasis from the Council of Europe. So this whole notion of moving away from the textbook, even though I did get involved with writing, I think it was part of the team for Tricolor 2, and then with Mike Buckby, we attempted Auto as well, which was meant to develop learner autonomy. More about that perhaps later. But we could do whatever we wanted. So it was possible to take pupils on day trips. At one stage, myself and a colleague taught pilots at British Midland because they'd just opened up an office in Paris. We taught the pilots and the stewardesses and so on. We taught them French, and in return, we got free tickets to take some of our learners over to Paris. That kind of, all of that kind of stuff. And I remember because I was head of faculty at the time, there was a policy that I put in place that every single year the learners had something very specific about languages that opened up their world, including doing some Russian as well. So it was a period in time where innovation and change was exciting, and I felt that we were given a green light to do things. And I mean, if I can tell you, probably the most important green light was we had an inspection I think it was a year after I'd been in Bigwood. And so I was inspected, and then after the and I was using cue cards. Remember cue cards with little pictures on them and no words at all, and getting the students to utter their own sentences and their own meaning. And I got a message afterwards saying the inspector wants to see you. And I thought, this is the end of my career. I'm done. I'm finished. And I went into the room and he said to me, "Doe, would you like to go to Rio de Janeiro?" So I said, yes, that would be really nice. And it was to do with the FEPF. And he was our, so basically I was invited to go to Rio to the World Conference in FEPF. And that really, then I met all these people that I'd only ever read about in my undergraduate studies, Meryl Swain and so on. They were all there. Hugo, Battensbeard, the whole lot of them were there. And of course, Oleg and Krapel for learner autonomy and so on. So that was a change, a huge change for me, because I then began to realize that for me, there never has really been this divide between theory and practice ever, because they're the same thing, just conceptualized together, and I'm weary with always reading about this gap. But for me, it didn't exist. And I always wanted to find out more, so that would lead me to being able to not just innovate for innovation's sake, but again, this drive to want all learners. That was the key thing, all learners, not just the ones that were good at languages, that's rubbish, but all learners to succeed and feel like they could do something with their language.
I want to go back a second because I'm sure Alan will then want to come in and talk a bit more about teaching and so on that you've already started. But there was a quotation which we often use and which struck me many years ago from Eric Hawkins. And I can't remember where it came from, whether it was at a lecture or in a book that he wrote, about how for him, a Liverpudlian working class lad, Spanish, which was the language taught rather than French in Liverpool, was an escape. And I remember he used the word escape, and it struck with me. But we're not talking about me today. But I wonder if that, because, well, you said you're, I think, also from Lancashire.
Oh, yes.
and from a, I don't know whether you would call it a working class family or whatever, but
oh, yes.
Was it an escape for you, or is that the wrong word?
No, it's the wrong word for me. It wasn't escape. It was it was building potential that is there in everybody, but it was understanding that the world was there to be taken if you knew how to take it and if you were prepared to take risks. And I guess I am prepared to take risks. It also means that sometimes you don't succeed, or sometimes you fail, and that is always difficult. But then you have to face all of that. So so I was always wanting to experiment with teaching methodology, because to me, as soon as you stopped thinking about it, that was the moment when fossilization took place. So and it made teaching really exciting as well. So I didn't see languages as an escape, but I did see them as a huge challenge, because I realized quite quickly that not everybody by any means shared this view of the world and liked languages. Well, correction, I didn't like languages. I liked what they did, and I didn't like the way that they were being taught. And so that was the difference for me. So I don't know whether that makes sense or not.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm sure Alan wants to come in, so I will stop for a moment. I'll come back in later, I think.
Yeah. Deb, when you get a chance to listen to the other interviews, you will find, although everybody's different, there are some remarkable similarities in some of the themes that we pick up from our early years, shall we say. I just wanted you worked in at least one disadvantaged school.
Three.
Three. So they were all three. Even better for my question then. I mean, you've already said that you believe all children should have opportunities to get on, but were there particular challenges in trying to sell language, as it were, in a disadvantaged area, even though you, like me, you probably came from one yourself?
Yeah. What I wasn't prepared to do was to go down the avenue. Well, it might be useful. You might go there on holiday, because most of these learners hadn't even gone into Nottingham City, or some of them hadn't. And, you know, some of their lives were difficult enough. I wanted them to develop a love of learning, and it happened to be languages. And then once in there, we could do all sorts of interesting things with them, which is what we did. I remember, because it was a new school, we had a loop. Do you remember those loops that used to go around the outside of the walls, around the, sorry, not on the inside of the walls? And I couldn't understand why this group of lads always wanted to do this, but I was delighted and thinking, oh, they're really liking the. I then realized that actually the loop linked them into citizens band radio. So they were communicating with lorry drivers. And, you know, I just thought that was one of the most hilarious things that I'd ever done. So then I suggested, well, okay, well, let's teach the lorry drivers some French. And, you know, it was that always from their world, making it more interesting, but not selling it as useful, good for your career, good for holidays, you know, getting away from the transactional, always the transactional, and getting into just enjoying the being part of the language.
Yeah.
So that's but in particular, at the time there was setting, and so clearly it you know, there were sets, and you know, the bottom set was always the, what are we going to do with the bottom set? That kind of, you know, discourse tended to go, not in all of the schools by any means. And to me, they were some of the best, because if you could interest them, you'd got somewhere. And so they were like my litmus paper, you know. And so if they were engaged and so on, that's really good. They weren't always by any means, but it was always about the moment, what was happening in the moment, and how we develop spontaneous use of language. And also it was very much in the era of not only graded tests and so on, but also CLIL as well was starting to become fashionable. And I'll talk more about that, because obviously that took me off in a slightly different direction. Not really, but partly. But to me, it was always about the content. Why on earth are we dealing with such ridiculous content when the learners have needs, they have lives, they're people, they've got interests? What are we doing with this pretend world? So it was always about the resources and so on, and just the tasks, humor.
Yeah, I want to come to CLIL in a moment, but there is more to Del Coyle than CLIL, but even though
yes,
probably what you're most known for, at least outside the UK. When you moved into teacher education in Nottingham, I got two separate questions really. Observing the schools in the East Midlands, which you knew many of firsthand anyway, in the period you were at Nottingham, what did you notice as changes in the circumstances in those schools? And then the second one was the Nottingham department had a reputation for innovation in pedagogy, particularly using different technologies. Could you, having said something about the first question, could you say something about some of the initiatives that you launched in collaboration with the schools in that period?
Yes, so I needed to go into teacher education because I didn't want to become a head teacher, or at one stage I was kind of in charge of of looking at uniform and that kind of thing. I just thought, no, I can't cope with this. And at the time, the universities were really wanting people like us with teaching experience, but still young enough in careers to develop in higher education. There was definitely a real call to get those people into universities, and we formed a young lecturers group, which lasted forever. It lasted for a long time, and it linked all of our crowd across universities. So that innovative strand went with us. And I'll say some more about technology in a moment. But I think your first question was, what were we noticing? What I was noticing is that that there was a very strong network of people who were, in your terms, languages people, and working through the associations and through SILT and so on. So I think there was starting to be a little bit of a change, but also like CSEs, GCSEs, they were all in the mix as well. And I still very, very strongly focused on this being for everybody and not just for particular students. So, however, when we went to when we set up in Nottingham, one of the key areas there was to use technology, because it was starting to use technology. The technology kind of I don't know, the revolution was happening, wasn't it? And I was particularly interested in video, because this had been linked to enabling children who couldn't travel to still communicate with people with using other languages. And at the time, I don't know whether I'm going too far ahead now, but at the time, not only were we keen to send out our teachers with some new ideas that needed more work doing on, needed to be developed, that they needed to own themselves. We weren't telling them what to do, but we wanted them to go in there and continue working themselves. So that was a really exciting time for PGCE. Sorry, it's DE in Scotland, it's CE in England. So it was an exciting time, and you know we had a very strong sense of community at that time, trying to look at the content of what we were doing and also linking in with other like literacies and so on that was happening in the primary sector and EAL and so on. The other thing about Nottingham was that we also worked very closely with the EAL. So we worked, you know, very, very, very closely with people who are well known in so TESOL and so on. And to me, it was seamless. But yet, actually, the two were so separate elsewhere. So I don't know whether that answers your question.
Oh yeah, and particularly the bit at the end there about EAL. It's always astounded me that there's been so little contact between modern language teachers in this country and ESOL, EAL, EFL.
I didn't understand it.
Acronym you want to use. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. A great move on. I haven't forgotten, Clill. We're coming back to that.
Yeah,
But that sort of takes us to the end of our second section. The third one is a sort of broader perspectives on languages in Britain. And then for the final session, I'll hand back to Mike to pick up some of the international stuff. Although I think you probably find that each of us will want to chip in the section we're not actually leading on, because that's the way we work. In any discussion about languages in Britain, you've got a particularly useful perspective, because you taught for a long time in England. You've been in Scotland for quite a time with your academic post. So you're able to go fresh to Scotland and see what they do there. And from Scotland, you've been able to look back into England at some of the developments that have been there in the last decade, which you probably wouldn't have been too happy with if you'd stayed this side of the border. I just wanted in general terms, I have two questions, I think. One is, when you got to Scotland, and what you've been able to observe at one remove, I know you've been some direct involvement as well. What were the particular initiatives or aspirations that struck you when you went to Scotland? And then looking back on England, knowing the English system very well, but being out of it for a while, I wonder if you had a view on what struck you, how things have actually developed in England in the 15, whatever number of years it is, since you moved to Scotland.
Okay, so moving to Scotland was a slight change, because in England, a lot of my teaching work had been with teacher education, with PGCE. But when I went up to Scotland, it was much more research focused and less to do directly with teacher education. I was, I am GTC registered, and that does sort of carry through, but there are some differences in regulations and so on for teaching in Scotland. Not that that made a big difference, but what I was most excited about was, well, first of all, there'd been all the primary initiatives about languages in the primary school. And in particular there was Walker Road in Aberdeen. And I was at the University of Aberdeen when I first went. And Walker Road to me embodied everything that had inspired me for so long. And that was a large primary school in not in the most elite area in Aberdeen by any means, where all the children were learning French, and they were learning it, but they were using it. And I think it was funded by Total, and they'd sent over French first language speakers as the teachers, but also the other teachers were involved, which was just it was just magical. And of course, there were funding issues, but for me, one of the issues was around, well, what do you do when that kind of experience has happened at primary school? What happens at secondary? Because there's lots of other children going to secondary school, and it's very contentious. I don't want to get into that, but it just proved to me that all the things that I believed in could work if the conditions were right, and of course the investment was there as well, because you do need investment. So I just felt as well that teaching and teachers were more respected in Scotland, and that languages were not disliked as much as they were in England at the time. So I'm just talking very, very generally now, and that learners were quite okay. They were happy to learn languages and so on. And I visited many schools, especially when we were doing some of the Italic project and so on. So those were the differences. And of course, Scottish Silt at the time was very strong. And I remember it was inspiring when Dick was involved. I can remember him doing all the annals and stuff that he used to do. And it was that was a gift for teachers as well. And then of course things started to change, as they do, because nothing's forever. So that is what I found when I went to Scotland. But at the same time, I was much more research oriented.
Okay, could I just interject there? Some listeners may not follow the allusion. Dick is, of course, Professor Richard Johnston, who we
Indeed.
all know very well. And if I remember rightly, he did an independent evaluation of Walker Road School. So if people want to know more of the detail, then
absolutely
they can pick that up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. And what about looking back into England from outside? What
it became very culturally, there's quite a disconnect between Scotland and England. And I began to understand for the first time why Westminster is problematic. And also being up in Aberdeen, I also understood why the central belt of Scotland was also problematic. but it just seemed that the cultures didn't necessarily completely overlap. They weren't one and the same. And so I became very much embroiled in more of the Scottish approach to things. But then I was working more and more and more with mainland Europe, and working with CLIL and literacies and so on in mainland Europe, which shifted me away slightly from classroom work. I've still continued to do matters of classroom research, but it was not necessarily in England and Scotland. And then, of course, there was the 1+2 policy, where I really did try very hard to try and persuade them that CLIL would offer opportunities, especially in primary school, but it wasn't really accepted. And by that stage, you know, the problem with these names, they label the labels, and then people don't necessarily accept that there are so many different ways to interpret those labels, and it's got to be context sensitive. It's got to be embedded in the culture and in the context. So there could have been Scottish CLIL, but anyway, it was a partial recommendation that was tucked somewhere at the back that said secondary schools might like to think about it.
And what?
So they saw. So can I just interrupt again? Maybe that was the 1+2 policy, was mother tongue +2, as it were, taken over from the European Union policy making at the time.
Well, it was partly that. It was partly the ambitions to become much more well, to keep taking account of Ireland and Wales as well. Of course, I haven't talked about Gaelic medium. I did quite a lot of work with Gaelic medium as well. But it was that sense of trying to really promote languages. So it was a kind of natural follow-on, which was very ambitious, and it was very welcome. It was very ambitious. But of course, unless you have the means to fund the implications of that, it is problematic. I mean, you know, expecting all teachers to be able to cope with teaching a language. I mean, what does teaching a language mean? And again, you know, it means so many different things, and it's so it's developing.
So and your suggestion for primary school might have been that a CLIL approach of some kind would have facilitated the 1+2.
Oh, absolutely. You know, because we can't have constant learning of numbers and days of the week and songs and so on. That's great with little tiny ones. That's fabulous. But by the time you're a P7, you're 11-year-old, that's not enough, you know. And it's the same old. I'm not being super critical at all of developments either in England or in Scotland in terms of language promotion, but it's very challenging. Whereas, you know, a lot of the work I was doing elsewhere in Europe, it was all English, and I've always felt, until relatively recently, I always felt a little bit of the odd person out, because everybody else was trying to promote English, and English was the very language I wasn't trying to promote. But I couldn't say it in quite those ways, and actually the underlying pedagogies were similar or the same. But I always felt that there was something missing, and that's where the literacies movement has really brought it, you know, brought it together for me anyway. Yeah.
Yes, Alan often says in our conversations how the very fact that Anglophone countries, and England and or Britain and UK in particular, that's our focus, but Anglophone countries have this problem that we speak English, and that it's far more difficult for teachers of foreign languages, let's call them, in the UK and other Anglophone countries than it is to teach English, or, as I would see it sometimes, just support the learning of English which happens usually outside the classroom in many
Sure.
countries, in Scandinavia, I know very much so. And so this specific, special circumstance of being an Anglophone country, as you say, then makes you slightly different. Would you go a bit more into this? Felt you made you feel different when you were working in, I suppose, in Europe, mainly in continental Europe, I mean.
Well, yes, because the British Council had a big role in it, and so people were interested in the kind of resources and so on that I wanted to develop for French. Russian then sort of disappeared really off the agenda, and that was when I began to feel that I really needed Spanish. But obviously I couldn't do anything. Well, I mean, I could have done everything, but you know what I'm saying there, that I wasn't fluent in Spanish at the time. So yeah, it was just that some of my preferred ways of working relied heavily on cultures that were different to the so-called English cultures or British cultures that were being represented. And so that's really where I am on that one. I've not answered that very well, but it's just a feeling that I always had. Also, I was working quite a lot with subject teachers as well. I mean, and for me, language is a discipline and always has been, and it's got its own culture. It's got its own. Yeah, it stands as not only it's our greatest learning tool, as well as sort of the content of what it opens up in terms of texts and literature and all that kind of stuff. Well, just content,
Yeah. Before we move towards the last section, we've started to talk about the international dimension a bit already, but all these things are overlapping, so that's no problem. But before we do that, looking at CLIL in the UK, and I'm thinking particularly of England, which obviously I know best. I think there are two things we probably agree on. One, that there's not been enough CLIL initiatives. Sorry, there are three things. Second, when it works well, it has worked well. And the third one is hardly any of the initiatives has been sustained for very long. And from your sort of dual take of having developed it at a crucial stage in England and then looking back either from Strasbourg, Graz, Brussels, wherever, as well as Edinburgh, sort of detached from it, I just wonder whether you had a view on why England sort of got itself into this situation.
Yeah, I mean, I now see the era that we're in, or it seems to me that England's it's back to the bell, what I call back to the bell curve, where it's measurement and all that kind of thing. And at the time when it was being developed in England, then there were one or two schools that were getting very, very close to having it examined, and that needed to be done. If the exams boards had enabled some GCSEs to be in French and German, Spanish, that I think would have made a huge difference. But they didn't, and they wouldn't, even though we promised them markers and everything else, because they said we don't have markers. I suspect at the time it was a concern about, if you open it up to European languages, what is the implication for other languages? That just brings in all sorts of other agendas. So that was a problem there. But there were several key schools that we all know about, where it was absolutely successful. But the reason why it wasn't sustainable is that it depended on one or two people. And when those one or two people moved away, or there was change in heads in the infrastructure of the school, it wasn't sustainable, because there wasn't the buy-in from government, I suppose, or policy to really invest in what it needed. Now, at Nottingham at the time, as you know, we had the BILD PGCE. And I would say that probably that was at the height of really using technology in amazing ways. So we did have a lab, a visual learning lab at Nottingham that I developed, which enabled certain schools to have video cameras in their classes. And there's more than one camera, and you could pick up what the children were saying, what the teacher was saying. And it was so successful because everybody bought into it. It wasn't about spying. We couldn't have got into the classrooms unless we were invited in, all that kind of stuff. It wouldn't go through all the channels now. But it also meant that with our student teachers who were future teachers of history, geography and science, they actually could have a teaching practice, French, German and or Spanish. And using the classroom in that way also meant that we were able to take what was actually going on in classrooms. We were looking at teacher language, we were looking at learner language, we were looking at the question why, right? Why don't we ask why? Much sooner than we do, and all that kind of stuff. So it was looking again at the discourse in the classrooms that needed to sustain interest in the language, but also some of the lessons were really what I would call traditional good. You know, they were looking at grammar points and so on. That's fine. So that was where we were at the height. But then things started to crumble when people moved on. And you know, with Lyd King and Bernadette, there was, I think, Lyd formed the language company or something, and we wrote CLIL recommendations or guidelines. And it was almost there. The embassies and so on were in it, but there just was not enough traction for it to be sustainable. So yes, it could be a project, and that's why I loathe the word project. I loathe it because a project has a start and an end. And none of this I wanted to be projects. I wanted them to be initiatives that then developed and went further, but they didn't. So, you know, and, you know, to people listening in, I think if you look back over one's career and one's opportunities, what I would look back on would be doing a part-time master's degree, where that was done with Roy Dunning. And although I was terrified of him because he was so serious and so knowledgeable. He was a lovely man.
That was at Leicester, was it?
Yes, that was at Leicester. And then my PhD was part-time as well. But by that stage, I had enough experience in the classroom to make it meaningful. So, you know, the privilege of being able to do that PhD at Hockrell and have all those, just monitoring all the things that those learners said, you know, minute by minute, was very, very special. And I appreciate that. And I think that's what has brought my interest into, you can have all the resources in the world, but it's the communication, that not ordering something, but the communication just between people, that really is at the nub of what I've tried to do.
Just a couple of things. You mentioned BILD. I think I know what it is, but if you could spell it out.
I'm sorry, I'm not being very good on people who don't know the jargon. I can give a
we put footnotes in when we
BILD was the bilingual integration of languages and disciplines. So it was the PGCE at Nottingham University that we were doing there, but it's developed out of an initiative, an Erasmus initiative actually, and then there was another initiative whereby it was Lancaster, Cambridge, and Nottingham were all involved in a dual qualification for teachers, French teachers, who went and did a Maitrise for a year in France, but also was doing a PGCE. So at the end of 2 years, they left as qualified teachers in 2 countries.
And I think that operated with Austria as well, if I remember.
I think it did, yes, yeah.
The other thing was a comment on the exam thing, because I remember this. There's a school in London that did
Yes.
geography.
Yes.
We know the one we're talking about.
Yes.
Which in my HMI role, I had certain things to do with. We actually, that was the first time I think exams had come up. We actually had a geographer from an English university who was fluent in Spanish, who was willing to, I can't write the papers or to moderate, if there's any doubt about the academic standard. And I remember the answer we got, well, you can only have an exam in England and Wales in either English or Welsh. And that's where the argument fell down. It wasn't more sophisticated than that.
No,
as
no,
I
no.
recalled at the time, but it wasn't desperately desperately helpful. There was one about that time which they did in another school in business studies in Sussex, which worked very well. That wasn't sustained for the reasons that you've mentioned. I think the conversation about CLIL and postgraduates and so on was sort of from abroad, is sort of moving us into the final section. No doubt CLIL will reappear in some form. But anyway, I'll pass it over to Mike and see where he wants to take us.
Well, I was wondering, as you're talking about these different initiatives, and I take your point very much about the word project, but these different initiatives. And as a listener or viewer from somewhere else in the world who might be only just beginning to think about CLIL, or as what's sometimes called EMI, where are there traces of all these initiatives that they would be able to, are there archives or traces that they can look at and learn from? That might be a question you can't answer just now, but it's something that we might try to make available.
I think, I mean, there are some reports like the Italic report is really worth reading. It's a very, very detailed report, and it's very good. I'm not sure whether ECML, the European Centre for Modern Languages, I'm not sure whether they have that history. I seem to remember at one stage someone was trying to write something about the development of CLIL over the years, but I'm never quite sure, how far back to go, because things have moved so much in what we mean by CLIL or what it can mean, and there's always the danger that then it becomes anything. Well, you just do a bit of content and you're doing CLIL, and so I do think there are very clear principles that define it. But then again, I'm back into labels, and my one wish was that CLIL would disappear as a label because it would become normalized. And of course, that's a fantasy, I guess. But that is where I would like it to be, because I think as soon as you put a label to something, then people have an interpretation of that label without really understanding the implications of what it could be and what the potential is and what you've got to do with it to make it your own. So, to me, ownership of this work is crucial. And, having worked extensively in many, many countries at very different levels, so at government level down to sort of classroom level and so on, I do feel that I've got a very sensitive view of what CLIL is, and sometimes it's interpreted in a way that I wouldn't necessarily do it, but it works. And it works because the pedagogic culture is different to what the Western world might be, or what, I can't even say the Western. I mean, there's so much difference even within a country. And so I'm much more cautious about what we mean by integrated learning. And that's why I'm very much now into sort of literacies, because I think developing sort of textual as well as linguistic fluency is a really, really nice way to, or it's an accessible way to actually bridge a gap between traditional language or legacy pedagogies and new ways of doing this in the classroom. But it's got to be owned by the people that are driving it.
I'm tempted to ask you to talk more about plurilingualism literacies. But I will ask you to talk, but simply to give a little bit of opening to those people who might be listening, who can then, of course, read the things that you've written, but just a little opening to that before we come back to other countries.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be very brief. I mean, literacy, people often, again, it's another label. And people think, oh, it's learning to read and write in your first language. No, it's not. Well, our interpretation of literacy is not that at all. It's having the skills to be able to manipulate multimodal texts. So not just a written text, but any kind of text, is be able to manipulate it, to understand it, to deconstruct it, to make meaning from it. And in some ways, it's what EAL have been doing for a long, long time, and what some of L1 have been doing in literacies as well. But it's actually enabling that to happen across different disciplines as well, because each discipline has their own culture and their own discourses and their own literacies. So scientific literacy is going to be different from geography literacies. But the pluri element of it is the way that you use your languages as resources to help you be able to access text at different levels and know what to do with it, rather than think of it as a word. That word means that word means something else. So to actually look at a broader sense of meaning. And once you arrive at that, I realized that I've been doing that for a long, long time. I've never called it that. But rather than always breaking it down to word lists and bilingual word lists and learn this vocabulary, sure, learning vocabulary is very helpful, but it's meaningless. It's just little tools, semiotic tools. Yeah. So, I think this is a way of enabling people, and the fluencies that we've worked on with the Gratz group has been very much looking, well, yes, linguistic fluency is working towards linguistic competence and fluency, we've called it, but textual fluency is just as important, and that is being able to access any kind of text, be it literally a text on a phone, to a great canon of literature, and being able to have the skills and understanding on how to make meaning from it, depending on your linguistic level.
Well, thank you. And I'm sure.
I don't know whether that's clear or not, but
no, that's clear. That's yes, and of course, people can then, that will tempt them into following things up a bit. And you mentioned Graz and so on, so there's plenty for people to get at through there as well, through the European Centre for Modern Languages. But we're getting towards the end of our time, and we're very grateful for your time. I would like just to, since this section is about other countries, but that's already written, if there were one thing, because let me make explicit what I'm trying to say here, not very well. The question of initiatives and sustainability, or lack of sustainability, and all that you've said about that. And my amateur view of CLIL, to use the label, in Germany is that it has been sustainable. I'm glad you're nodding at that, so I'm not completely wrong. Is there any way in which one can learn from the German experience? What is it that they've got that other countries, and maybe not just the UK, don't have, which helps them to sustain?
Most of the work that I've done actually is in Spain.
Okay.
But I mean, equally, I mean, in comparison to the UK and to many countries, it's very successful, is CLIL in Spain. I'm currently working in the Basque Country, and the government is paying for it's about 60 schools now that have been working with us on a year-long basis. They're doing action research into looking at pluriliteracies in the trilingual setting. So we're looking at this not just from bilingual setting, but trilingual. And so there's still the drive, however, hidden in there, that English is really, really important. And I don't think we'll ever be able to get away from that. And I think it's down to two reasons. Firstly, even if it's in trilingual settings, and I've done work in Sri Lanka and places like that where again it's trilingual. Even when it's with other languages, English is still quite a drive there, okay? But also the learning cultures are very specific, and I think in some, this might be naive, I don't know, but I can't help but feel in some countries the desire to learn may well be stronger than it is in other countries, and that drive to want to accept that learning can not always be fun, because I refuse to use the word fun. I never want languages to be fun. I want them to be inspiring, and sure, we can laugh a lot, but not fun. I'm not there to entertain. And also, sorry, really, there's a third one as well, and that's the exam system. And as long as you've got a rigid exam system that is demanding of students to do certain things, they will have to do it. So if you take Italy and CLIL, that's an interesting one, because learners, students, older students are required to do some CLIL, and they do it. So if the exam is such, and if you want to get to particular universities, or you want to get into particular strands in upper schools and so on, then the system itself is there. And so there's kind of a control or a forcing element that we don't have, because obviously the amount of time that we spend learning languages is limited. So those would be, so it's the Englishness, it's the cultures, the learning cultures, and the kind of the exam structure, the infrastructure, which raises expectations from learners and parents and schools, obviously.
Mm. So English is obviously a factor, but not the only factor. And that's interesting what you say about that. You also remind me of something, again, that Eric Hawkins said or wrote somewhere, that the disastrous decision for language teaching in England was when the universities, or I don't know quite at what level the decision was made, but universities stopped requiring a language at GCE, as it was at the time, as an entrance qualification. And from that point on, we had problems. Yes.
Which is what I've just been saying in terms of the exam system.
Exams, exactly so.
I mean, take Latin. You had to have Latin in the UK, didn't you? To go to certain universities, you had to have Latin at O level or GCSE or whatever. I don't know about when it stopped, but I had to have Latin.
Yeah. Yes. Well, okay. I think we need to stop soon, but I would like, listening to you talk at the end about plurilingual literacies and all the things that you've done, etc., and thinking back to what you said about your first experience of language learning in grammar school. And of course, none of us are criticizing that things have moved on and so on, but things have moved on. And you're a different kind of language person to the teacher of French who was in your grammar school a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So you are a different kind of language person to what you started out as and what they were at the time.
Yes, I mean, I think for all of us, it's going back to that drive and that commitment. And so you ask most teachers what they really want, and they want to make a difference. That's what drives the the underpinning of the professional of the professional company, I guess. So I think it is about making those differences, but what I value most is having the opportunities that I don't think are as available now as they were then, even though, in many ways, when I look forward to what AI and so on might offer for languages, I mean, it's just like off the scale in terms of its potential. But I don't think the opportunities are quite so readily available. So I'm talking about free education. I'm talking about the way that we were encouraged, that we were enabled to travel through Erasmus and all these other schemes. I swapped my job when I was working in one of the schools in Nottingham for 1 year. And it was a scheme whereby you just simply swap jobs with somebody. You swapped your homes, your cars. You carried on being paid by your normal school. So there was no problems with tax and everything else. And those kind of initiatives where you learn, you know.
So you swapped jobs with someone in France or something?
Yes, in Alsace. I went to Alsace.
Alsace.
And, you know, I mean, it was magical from an experiential perspective. So, you know, in terms of what's around the corner for new teachers, all I can, you know, my only advice for people is look for opportunities, seek them out, and just, you know, just do it.
Well, thank you very much. Alan, maybe you would take the last word. I usually do this, but I think you would like to do this.
No, there's so many other things we could have talked about, but that happens in all these interviews.
Oh, I'm sure.
But the question we always ask at the end here, is there anything you would particularly have liked us to ask you about that we haven't asked you about? Because now's your opportunity.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting question, because that's what I always ask at the end of a PhD viva. You know, what else have you really got to say that we? I mean, I think it's about people, and I think it's about enablers, and so I don't really want to mention names, because if I miss anybody out, then that would be dreadful. But the other thing is that I've been enabled to do this by other people, and so like Professor Johnson, if we will, I can remember him talking to me when I was still a teacher at a conference, and I just thought, oh, there's a professor talking to me and he's interested in my work. You know, that kind of thing. And I always think it's really important now that I'm there. I'm only there because other people helped me get there. But, you know, the colleagues that I had along the way, and currently the colleagues that I'm working with, have been people that make it matter. And I just wish for everybody to find those networks, because we can't do it on our own. You know, nobody's in this for themselves. And so, you know, right back to Rio de Janeiro, right up to what happens if I walk along a corridor, you know, all of those things are about people and about reaching out to each other, supporting each other. So that is a kind of message that I have, that I'm only here because of the people enabled me to get here.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that experience and that sentiment, though, fortunately.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I've no idea. You know, the one thing I was worried about, I didn't want this to be the Coyle show, but it's from the heart. So what it's always difficult to talk about yourself.
Yeah.
But I just think it's really helpful sometimes just to stand back and reflect. We're always asking our students to reflect and so on. And I just think it's really helpful. And would you believe that when I was just going through a few things, there's a whole host of stuff that I'd forgotten I'd even done, you know, because it's it's a while ago now. And I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, you know, it's clip and there's a whole load of initiatives that are all part of this movement, this dynamic, and it's still there. It won't be in the same way, but it will still be there for people now, but it would just be different ways of doing all of this. So
I am quite happy that this was the Coyle show, as you put it, because that's what we want. I mean, this is what these interviews are about the people and how their lives and so on, but also their thinking and their enthusiasm. So I think that's been very clear from this afternoon, from our conversation, and I've certainly enjoyed it. I hope you have, and I hope Alan has, and I'm sure our audience will when this becomes public.
Well, thank you very
much. Thank you,
Thanks a
Joe. It's
lot,
great.
Joe.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.